Once upon a time, I was a young writer trying to convince myself that writing was not a sustainable career. Every day I would take a different job that was sort of a riff on writing, but never quite writing full time, until one day I decided to take a bet on myself and publish my first book. Because of that, I am now working for myself, and until finally today, I feel good about calling myself an author. And ever since that day, I haven't looked back.
Welcome to A Life Worth Working, a podcast about how we get to the soul of work. We're your hosts, Michelle Weise and Dana Allen Walsh. I'm an education and workforce strategist, and Dana is a senior pastor of a progressive church.
And in this episode, we chat with Simone Stolzoff, author of The Good Enough Job, Reclaiming Life from Work. One of the first things Simone said to us was,
you shake a bottle for long enough and eventually it explodes. So in my 20s, I spent my entire 20s sort of dancing around the idea of calling myself a writer.
That shaking was Simone trying to convince himself he couldn't write as a career.
Simone kept doing work that was adjacent to writing, copy editing, working in advertising. His hesitation started when he went to college at the University of Pennsylvania and found himself a poetry student amidst a sea of pre-professionals.
I was a poetry student at this financial institution, and so many of my peers were working for investment banks or for consultancies, and I knew that wasn't the path for me, but I was still scared of taking a risk. And so my first job out of school was at an advertising agency as a copywriter, because I thought copywriting, that's sort of like the business equivalent of being creative or being a writer. I didn't want to be a struggling artist. I was really inspired to try and, set myself up for a career where I could both do good and do well. And I didn't think that writing was a way that I could do well. I thought it was just a way that I could do good or fulfill that creative passion for myself. It wasn't until I really looked myself in the eye and said, okay, this is the thing that hasn't gone away. Ever since the second grade, you skipped your brother's birthday party so that you could do creative writing in class in school. There has been this common thread.
This thread of knowing it wasn't the path for me comes up in many of our conversations. And it's worth noting that finding a roadmap to the future is hard when it's somebody else's. But finding your own path can be sometimes scarier or seem at face value not sustainable, as Simone put it.
It took him a decade to dance around what was drawing him in. It took him a fair amount of trial and error to recognize the insistence of that desire to write. He had been both batting it away as an option while also putting so much into the idea of a dream job.
I had spent my entire 20s trying to search for that dream job, a vocational soulmate, something that could help me self-actualize. And it wasn't until I took some of the pressure off and said, rather than my job being the central axis around which I center my career, what if I think about my job as one way to support the life I want to live? And I felt that it was an idea that might be resonant with many of my peers who had spent their lives searching for the proverbial dream job only to be disappointed or laid off. And so this idea of sort of the good enough job was born out of my own experience.
I love that. And in your book, you talk about how one of the risks in our work-centric culture is that we don't just give our jobs and our work our best hours or many, many hours of our week, but we also give our work our best energy too. And you quoted psychologist Esther Perel, who says, too many people bring the best of themselves to work and they bring their leftovers home. And I'm curious what it's looked like for you to create boundaries on your work and to seek out other ways of getting fulfillment.
Yeah, I remember the first time I read that quote, it sort of hit me like a brick. The idea that we have to do what we love for work or we have to bring our best energy to work is so obvious that it doesn't even bear repeating. And yet, I think there are a few risks. One is the one that you mentioned, which is that we can neglect other parts of who we are. Certainly we are all more than just workers. We are neighbors and friends and family members and citizens and amateur musicians. And, those other identities are sort of like plants. They require time and energy to grow. And if we don't invest in them, they can wither. So I think that's one huge risk. Another one is that our jobs might not always be there. So many people treat their work as if it's their identity, as if it's their family, their primary sense of community. And especially during the pandemic, I think a lot of people learned the hard way. As much as you might want your job to be your family, the employer's reaction to that is transactional. And so many people were laid off. I spoke to several folks who thought if you are what you do and you lose your job, they were left asking what's left. And then the third is just a matter of expectations. I often think about happiness as sort of the difference between our expectations and our reality. And if we're always expecting our jobs to be a dream, if we're always expecting them to be a source of love, to be perfect, then it creates a lot of room underneath that for disappointment.
We expect so much out of work. We expect it to be a dream, a source of love and fulfillment. In a way, it comes to be the placeholder for other institutions that have fallen away in society.
I think one of the reasons we've gotten to this point as a society is that a lot of the other forms that once provided meaning, purpose, community, and identity, things like organized religion or neighborhood and community groups, these civic institutions, have broken down. And then it's no wonder why people turn to their jobs, where they spend the majority of their time to try and fulfill all of these basic human needs of belonging, identity, and purpose. I bought into the delusion that a perfect job could lead to a perfect life, and thinking about work as the central axis of my existence and everything else orbiting around it. And we must not mistake that for the entirety of who we are. And therefore, we've got to exist in other realms in the world. Our jobs are one container that hold one sense of what matters in the world. Maybe it's the bottom line or the sales target for that month or the number of new subscribers to your company's newsletter. But that's just one container with one value system. And so I really try and encourage people to find other containers that have other value systems. So for example, on my Frisbee team, they don't care how many books I've sold or how many words I've written. They care that I show up on time and that I'm showing up for my teammates in supportive ways. It's just a reminder that we all exist on this earth to do more than just produce economic value for one organization.
So how exactly do we create those boundaries and make sure we seek out other paths to fulfillment?
The idea that you should care less about your job is not very actionable, right? What should I do with that piece of information? One of the most actionable things that people can do is just find other communities that reinforce these other identities that you have. I think that's something nice about this podcast that you guys share, or other ways of showing up in the world. It's nice to be around people who couldn't care less about what you do for work, just to reinforce the fact that you are more than what you do for work. I tend to encourage people to care about other things. So for me, that means play on a club ultimate Frisbee team, which is a source of exercise and a source of community for me. My wife and I are learning how to salsa dance, which is another hobby. I'm making sure that, the relationships that I feel are very important to me are reflected in my calendar and how I spend my time, whether I'm making time to call people that I love or go on weekly walks with my best friend. And so I think about this quote that a grad school professor told me, which is that show me your calendar and I'll show you what you value. And so that's what I encourage other people to make sure that how you spend your time is reflective of the things that you purportedly care about and the things that matter to you.
Simone also recommends starting small, so that we also don't have to make the mistake of converting leisure into work.
My advice is just to start smaller, rather than thinking that you need to run a marathon or develop a side hustle or a side grind or read 52 books or what have you. The small actions in your daily existence that reinforce these other identities that you hope to cultivate. And the research backs this up. It shows that people who have diverse identities, people who have what researchers call greater self-complexity, who have developed other facets of who they are, tend to be be more innovative and creative problem solvers. They tend to be more resilient in the face of something like a recession or a layoff. And so that's sort of like the business case. But there's also the moral case, which is that we all have a responsibility to invest in our lives outside of work, in our relationships, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our physical health, in our mental health. And these all require time and attention. So, rather than thinking about having to run a marathon in order to find that other identity, I'd think about the things that are more evergreen, the things that no job or market or injury can take away from you. I learned about this a lot from speaking with people in the chronic illness community, folks who might not be able to control how productive they are, how much energy they have in a given day. And this one person in particular, Liz, she told me that she started defining herself based on her evergreen characteristics. I am a loyal friend. I am generous with my time. I care about these civic issues, these things that no market or employer could ever take away from her. And I think that's a really nice way to frame how we can cultivate these other facets of our being. Who is the person that you want to be? And that's my definition of a good enough job. A good enough job is a job that allows you to be the person that you want to be in the world.
I love this. A good enough job allows you to be the person that you want to be in the world.
Simone had mentioned Esther Perel, the psychologist, and she was recently talking about how with the new age of swiping and using apps to find your next mate, looking for your relationship has become a strange sort of consumer experience. She urges us to consider the first thing is, instead of asking yourself all the time, what am I looking for or who am I looking for, why don't you ask yourself, who would you like to be in this relationship? In a similar vein, rather than looking at jobs and trying to sort through what is the perfect job for me with the right kinds of responsibilities, we might want to ask, who would I like to be in this next role?
And at the same time, who we are in this role shouldn't encapsulate everything about us. What Simone is suggesting instead is that we find different ways of diversifying where we gain meaning in our life. It's an investment approach. It also shows how we can bring our values into play. And it reminds me a lot of the eulogy virtues that David Brooks has written about, which are distinct from resume virtues. He says, the resume virtues are the skills you bring to the marketplace. The eulogy virtues are the ones that are talked about at your funeral, whether you were kind, brave, honest, or faithful. Were you capable of deep love?
Simone calls them evergreen characteristics. Who do we want to be when we maybe can't control who we are in our work lives? If we diversify the sources of meaning and identity in our lives, we are less likely to feel crushed when our work lives must shift. So we actually need to add more complexity to our lives so that we aren't just identifiable by one big thing. And this is inordinately difficult to do because of the ways in which work can consume our lives. One thing I love is this image that you share about how work can end up being a gas that just keeps filling a room. And I think it's interesting, especially as we think about knowledge work in particular and hybrid and remote work, where the boundaries between your actual workplace and your home life are blurred much more. It's just hard to know where one thing ends and one thing begins. And I'm wondering if, to prevent this gas of work from filling our lives, what is a tip that we can take away to be better about that boundary making?
Yeah, work is incredibly leaky, as you mentioned. If you were in the 1950s working on the assembly line at the Ford plant, you structurally couldn't help assemble cars from your living room. And yet now we all carry around these offices in our pockets and we can work basically whenever we want. I think it's important to have some sort of ritualized sense of when you're on and off the clock. This was what my TED Talk was about, this idea of having time sanctuaries or having spaces in our days and our weeks and our lives where work is not an option. A few of those examples for me, my wife and I have a weekly weekly date night. So every Thursday night we go out to dinner, and that's sort of sacred time. We have other boundaries, like we don't bring our phones into the bedroom as a spatial separation of when work is available and when work isn't available. I think one of the great things that you can do is opt into activities like going for a run or like going on a walk with your best friend that structurally prevent you from working. It's one thing to have an intention to work less, and it's another thing to not be able to work because your phone is at home and you are going on a walk.
Work is like a gas. It's incredibly leaky and fills up space and time if you let it. We can easily check emails at family picnics, take Zoom calls on sick days, and edit spreadsheets in the passenger seat.
We live in a culture obsessed with productivity and achievement. Grind and hustle, toil and sweat, work hard and play hard. It's all around us. In order to contend with this phenomenon, we have to be deliberate and intentional in how we delineate boundaries.
And this will likely require constant experimentation and negotiation. As he says, it's about trying to figure out the role of work in our lives.
I don't have it figured out myself. I think this is like a constant struggle of trying to figure out work's role in our life. And it is through having this conversation and trying to negotiate and renegotiate our relationship to work that we figure out what we care about. It's much more of a wobble than a static equilibrium. And so that's what I would encourage people to do as we leave this conversation is experiment. Try different things that might work for you. I think there are many different ways to develop a healthier relationship to work, but your relationship will be personal to you.
Simone reminds us that what you do for work is not the entirety of your worth, your existence. When we create identities for ourselves outside of work, we remember our worthiness in just being who we are and how we are intrinsically connected to others and the world around us. When we step back from work, it's hard to tell the difference between the bank president and the cashier.
We are reminded that our connection to others isn't always a vertical one of who has power over or under, but that we share power with one another. Ultimately, we are all human. We are all connected. Each person has intrinsic value outside of what we produce, acquire, or consume. Work, as Simone suggests, is just one container amongst a multitude of containers of our complex selves. Don't let it be the biggest container, because it easily can become that if you let it.
Thanks to Simone for reminding us that we are more than producers and consumers in this world. We were born to heal, to grow, to be of service to ourselves and our communities, to play, to experiment, to create, to dream, and to connect.
This has been another episode of A Life Worth Working. She's Dana Walsh.
And she's Michelle Weise. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends and loved ones who may be searching for purpose and meaning in their work lives, or what we call the soul of work.